Okay, I guess we were on page 49, and we were just about to do the just war theory, which I'm not going to do, not yet. We'll work our way up to it. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the concept of international relations, which, of course, arises before you get into a war. I mean, how are you going to have a war if you don't, first of all, have nations so that they can have a war? So we have to first understand how the history of international relations arose. If you go back to the ancient times, it was very simple. We have a nation, and everybody else is our enemy. Right? That's how it was. Obviously, it wasn't the easiest condition to carry on normal livelihood. But we got a resolution for that of sorts in the Western society. We got the Roman Empire. They solved it because that's simple. Everybody's Roman. See, we're all in this together. Of course, the barbarians are the enemies, right? But we can bring them in. We'll get them into the Roman Empire and hide them as our Prussian troops, hire them, and so forth. So anyway, basically you had the Pax Romana. Rome rules everything. We achieve peace by total empire control. You have the jus gentium, common laws that apply to the subjugated nations. Of course, it's a Roman law. So this notion of the Roman law entailed, in part, natural law. I mean, people were not unaware of there being a kind of natural law just because they didn't know the existence of God by metaphysical demonstration. One can develop a kind of natural law up to a certain extent as simply being the law of the peoples, the law of nations, as being what is common to all humanity. Some of it, of course, in addition, would be positive law. When you come to the later medieval period of Christendom, as far as the known world was concerned, the Christian princes ruled the earth, and the Christian nations turned toward the church for guidance. So again, you had the jus gentium, you had the natural law, and you even had canon law, which, as you know, canon law could actually supersede the power of the king in some cases. I mean, you had a kind of interesting balance of power between the king, who had natural rights over his subjects on the one hand, but on the other hand, he too was a subject of God and a subject of the church. And therefore, if he got too far out of line, for example, if he mistreated clerics or the property of the church, he could be subjected to ecclesiastical discipline, of course the ultimate being excommunication. Or he could even have his lands placed under interdict, which was in some ways even worse, because excommunication means you can't have the sacraments. Interdict means nobody gets them. And if that doesn't make the people mad at you, nothing will. I haven't heard of this being applied very much recently, but interestingly enough, it did happen once. I mentioned this to you before in 1953 at Jesuits Bend, Louisiana. Archbishop Joseph Rummel sent a black priest, a Negro priest, to be pastor of the town church. Now, this is 1953. The people wouldn't accept him. So Archbishop Rummel said, fine, you don't accept my priest, you're under interdict. You don't have access to the sacraments, period, until you send the priest I send to you. I'm trying to remember now, since it was some 60 years ago. I don't remember how it was resolved, but I suspect the Archbishop won in those days. That's the last time I remember hearing of an interdict being applied. But it's a very powerful weapon if you're dealing with a Catholic community that is respectful of and concerned about, respectful of the church and concerned about their immortal souls. Of course, that doesn't work so well today because it's harder to find people who even know they have souls, say nothing of the immortal ones, or ones they want to save. That's asking a bit much. Anyway, after the 16th century breakdown of Christendom through the Protestant Revolution, what we find happening is, of course, no longer the hegemony of the church dominating civil society. You have to remember, in the medieval period, it wasn't like the Pope told the people what to do, but it was more a matter of the church reining in the excesses of the temporal rulers, so that if the king mistreated his subjects too badly, he would be subject to ecclesiastical sanction. It wasn't always a matter of simply protecting church property. As I mentioned to you before, some of the canonical regulations concerning holy days, and it governed also days on which you could make war. And the church, in a way, was making war on war by making more and more holy days. And on holy days, you weren't allowed to make war. So, and during Lent, you couldn't make war. So the more holy days there were, the better, from the church's perspective, because she didn't want her subjects to be killing each other. But after the breakdown of the unity of Christendom in the 16th century, you had the emergence of the nation states, and of course, no longer the respect for the papacy that we had in the medieval period. So you began to develop what was known as international law, because the nations, as individual states, had to deal with each other, and you did need some kind of a common basis for interacting without necessarily going to war every 2 minutes, and without considering every other nation necessarily to be an enemy. Hugo Grotius wrote a book at that time called The Rights of War and Peace, which codified the customs of the nations at the time, and that became a basis for international law as time went on. International law is a composite of natural law and positive law between sovereign nations. And as you know, when we look at civil society today, the laws that we have are a composite of natural law and positive law. Of course, the positivists think that it's all positive law, but the positive law that is licit is ultimately based upon natural law. So even though they don't know it, it is based on natural law. As far as nations are concerned, you've got to kind of think of nations as sovereign persons. In other words, just as we are persons, nations attain a kind of legalistic personhood because they represent a unity of a people. And therefore, as a unity of a people, they have certain natural rights. One of the natural rights, just as you have, is the right to self-defense. I don't have the right to destroy your being as a unified being by chopping your head off, and neither does one nation have the right to destroy the unity of another nation by taking away part of its land. Moreover, this is a little bit hard for some people to accept, or some nations to accept, there is a natural equality between nations regardless of the size or the power of the nation. I mean, that's a little bit, obviously smaller nations will insist, even though we're smaller than you, we have the right to exist and you have to respect us and treat us as equals. And that's true. The problem, of course, is that sometimes really big nations have a tendency to want to dominate the little nations, right? So we had this problem, of course, with the Soviet Union trying to gobble up every nation that it could all around its territory. And that is one of the difficulties. But in terms of natural law, ought not take place. Now, of course, as you and I know, natural law is usually observed between nations only because it's a matter of power maintaining the independence of smaller nations, often by treaties or by alliances which protect them. It usually isn't just because the bigger country is sweet and gentle. Although it is a fact, by and large, that democracies tend to be less bellicose than dictatorships, because after all, a dictator may go on grandiose concepts of gaining greater and greater power and more territory, whereas if the people rule a democracy, they naturally tend to want peace so that they can live their lives in peace and not have to send their children to war. So there's a natural tendency among representative governments to be more pacific than dictatorships. Not necessarily in every case, but there's a tendency. States are natural institutions because they are, after all, civil societies. Civil society is a natural institution. Bear in mind, of course, that's where the contract law people don't really see it that way. That's where the positivist wouldn't see it that way, because they don't consider that anything is a natural. And even you and I are not natural beings. We're just piles of atoms, remember? So why would a society have any greater dignity or unity or purpose or rights than we as individuals really have? So it becomes more difficult for somebody from a positivistic, materialistic perspective to recognize that there are what we might call inalienable rights on the part of other nations, just as there are inalienable rights on the part of other people. States are composed of human beings, and because of that, they must follow the natural law. Civil society is a creation of God, not of man. We determine who rules, we determine the system of ruling, but the existence, remember, of government or civil society is a natural institution. And when you say natural, it means that it's something that is ordained by God in the creation of man to be a substantive reality, something that is naturally existent, not something we simply invent. Government and society doesn't exist because we invented it. We naturally create it, but it's because we're made to be members of society by our nature. So there is a difference between the way that an atheistic, positivistic, materialistic person would look at a nation as opposed to the way a natural law philosopher would look at a nation. Indeed, the force of agreements between nations presupposes the natural law of contracts. Remember, our ability to enter into a contract arises because we are free agents and we are able to agree about the terms of a contract. And we are bound by those terms because we have consented to the contract. If we as individuals can do that, so can nations. And thus they can enter into treaties that are mutually binding. I'm not trying to cover every possible aspect here. Obviously, you could write an entire book on just international law. I'm just trying to hit some high points, so if you have some questions, I probably don't know the answer, but you can ask them anyway. The state, in other words, is what we call a moral person, just like a business. That means that they can interact with other states according to commutative justice, as equals. Just like I can sell you a car, and you can pay me for the car, so the United States was able to purchase the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon, and he could sell it to us. That's a licit thing to do. I don't know how the French felt about it, but it was the representation of their government. And I don't see us about to give it back. International justice. International justice means that the states, as moral persons, are juridically equal. In other words, if you have a little tiny country like, I was going to say Monaco, but I guess that's not completely independent.
The Duchy of Fenwick.
A real one, Liechtenstein, okay? I think that one's real. Is that a duchy of somebody's?
No,
There's always that little tiny country. Is it
Andorra?
Andorra, between Spain and Portugal? Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, but it's an autonomous region, and it has to be treated equally. Of course, then you have what is it, Alsace-Lorraine, that had the misfortune of existing between France and Germany, basically. So they just keep going to war with each other, and whoever wins gets it, because it's in the middle. So, but it's not supposed to be that way. I mean, in terms of ethics. States are moral persons. They are juridically equal. They must be treated as equal before the law. So that if a state, even though it be small, have the right to possess a certain part of its territory, no other country has the right to simply come and take it. That, of course, is what just basically happened between Russia and Georgia. Remember? Just a few years ago. The Russians simply started carving up Georgia. I'm amazed they're still there, because Georgia's very tiny and Russia's very big. But that's what can happen if it's just a matter of force of right, or a right of force. And that, of course, is what is not ethical. A nation doesn't have the right to simply gobble up its neighbors because it's more powerful than they are. And of course, geography can play a huge role, but Poland has had the misfortune of being geographically sitting between Russia and Germany. You know, you really should move the country some other place. And again, of course, conversely, the United States and Canada have been blessed by having a big ocean on either side. That's good placement. Also, because they are juridically equal, no state is subordinate to another state, which means all societies, all states, have the right to seek the common good of themselves. And that doesn't mean, of course, you can violate the rights of other states. In other words, what we have to understand is there is an analogy as we individual human beings are to each other as nations are to each other. And just because you happen to weigh 300 pounds and your next door neighbor weighs 50 pounds doesn't give you the right to pound him into the dirt. And neither does the fact that you have a large country, does that give it the right to subjugate smaller countries. History, of course, does not respect natural law very well in this regard. We have a right of independence for a state. Independence is to the state as life is to the individual person. Because basically, if you lose your independence, what has happened is you have had your existence destroyed. If you lose your independence, you've been absorbed. It doesn't matter if the invading country allegedly maintains your existence. I mean, look at Vichy France during the war. Was it independent under Marshal Pétain? Hardly. The war, I'm sorry, World War II. Again, showing how old I am. Independence was a facade, but it wasn't real. So France, for all practical purposes, had been annihilated, had been absorbed under the Third Reich. The fact that you continue to have a puppet government doesn't mean that you're operating independently. And also, curiously enough, just as a person has the right to life, so a state has a right to independence, which conversely means you don't have a right to commit national suicide. I mean, after all, what peoples would be willing to do that? You might ask, well, how do they do that? Simple, just, have your leader be someone like Quisling, for those who remember. He was the Norwegian head of state who allowed the Germans simply to come in and take over. His name was equated to that of traitor, Benedict Arnold, we would say in the United States, but Quisling handed over Norway basically to the Germans. But conversely, nations can freely, if they choose, merge with other nations, but it has to be a mutual free consent on the part of both nations. And if they wish, they can divide. Sometimes this happens. In fact, it just happened in Sudan, where the northern Sudan was separated from southern Sudan. We're being attacked.
Czechoslovakia?
Yeah, that's an excellent example because it originally was Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and then was it after World War II that they were merged?
No, it was originally Czechoslovakia in 1920, and then.
But it was formed in 1920. It was formed.
It was formed in 1920,
Yeah.
and then after World War II, it was still Czechoslovakia, and then 1990 was the fall of Berlin Wall.
So that's when you get the Czech Republic and.
There was the Velvet Revolution.
Yeah. But
And the Velvet Divorce.
a good friend of mine was the last head of the Catholic Party in Slovakia, just before the communists took over. So I am keenly aware that Slovakia and the Czechs are two different nations. They always have been two different nations. They were merged somehow, as you said, in 1920. And of course, what they've done is to do their natural thing and just split up again.
Yugoslavia.
Well, yes, of course. Yugoslavia is a political fiction that just lasted so long.
Quebec.
We won't go there.
Well, that's ours.
Entirety, nations have a right of entirety, which means a right to territorial integrity. Which means, of course, if you try to take part of the land of a country, that's a causa bellum, that's a cause of war. They will and they have the right to go to war to defend their integrity, to their territorial integrity as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean, there's two perversions you got to be careful of here. One is, that doesn't mean a right to nationalism. It doesn't mean, in other words, that you can create nations by grouping races together. That would not be recognizing the dignity of human persons. This sometimes is a problem because you have, for example, in the Middle East, you have the Kurds are found in multiple countries, but there isn't there isn't I guess, is there a Kurdistan?
Yes, Kurdistan, yes.
Yeah, but the problem is there are a lot of Kurds that are not in Kurdistan, such as in northern Iraq.
Kurds are in the way.
So I'll let you edit that out. And also, the other thing you don't have is the right to Lebensraum, as living room. That's what Hitler, the Third Reich, said, the German people are naturally superior, and the Aryan race needs more room. We need to expand. So we need to go into Austria, which is, naturally part of Germany, isn't it? I speak the same language. And, of course, that was used to justify expansion until we wound up with World War II. So I'm not really sure how one applies that to the expansion of the Americans to the West. I doubt if the American Indians were, I wonder how many times they look at what Hitler did and wonder, But there are other principles that may apply to that. Well, actually, the next point kind of touches on that, and that is the concept of colonization. Can you form colonies? Of course, in part, one looks at the rationale that is given, you wonder where it's coming from, because sometimes the people that are developing the theory of colonization are the colonialists. But the concept, it's based on this. It depends on the present degree of occupation and self-governance of the people that are living there. I've seen the argument, for example, that when the white men took over what was not yet the United States, but as it was proceeding west, the argument was that the Native Americans were not establishing permanent settlements, that they were pretty much, what's the term for people to move?
Peripatetic.
No, there's another word.
Nomadic.
Yeah, they were more nomadic, and that as such, basically it comes down to whoever first establishes permanent settlements has the natural right to establish a government, and that nomadic tribes by themselves do not have this power. I'm not sure how the nomadic tribes felt about this, but this is part of the rationale for colonization. I suppose in a way it's an academic question at this point, since everything that could be colonized has already been colonized, and now we're living in an age of decolonization, if anything, so I guess it would not be so relevant. But if you ask what was the philosophical or ethical rationale for colonization, it had to do with whether the people in the region actually were capable of self-governance in a meaningful way, and if they were not, then those who moved in and established farms and settlements would be considered proper matter for establishing a governmental unit. Of course, then when you talk about the formation of treaties, you look at the treaties that were formed by the American government with the Indians. I think somebody said they'd never seen a treaty that wasn't broken. And I recall when I was in high school, one of my teachers mentioning a book at that time entitled 100 Years of Dishonor.
Century of Dishonor.
Was that what it was? Which basically, well, as you probably can see if you see some of the signs out by some of the Indian gas stations, what's that line? I saw one about if you want to know if the government will keep its words, just look at a history of treaties, something like that. But that is a problem, and of course also raises an interesting question about the role of treaties between governments, because you can enter into treaties. It seems you can also withdraw from treaties. And of course, we have a very curious provision in the American Constitution, which says that if we enter into a treaty, that has binding force that supersedes the Constitution, which ought to be enough to raise the fur on the back of anybody's neck. Right now, the concern about that has to do with the right to keep and bear arms, because there is an international treaty being proposed through the United Nations, which affects the conduct and commerce in weaponry, guns, and the concern of some people in the United States is, what does that do to the Second Amendment? Because there's language in the treaty about control coming from a UN agency. And then the question arises, well, who dominates if there's a conflict? And given the fact, and it is a fact, that the treaty supersedes the Constitution, the worry is that the Second Amendment might suddenly simply be abrogated by treaty. I'll let you go home and worry. Nations have the freedom of action, which means they have a right to develop and to compete with one another. This is analogous to what you can do in free enterprise. But remember, not ruthlessly. Just like you can't have anti-productive investment, neither can you have ruthless competitions between countries. I suppose one of the examples of a non-ruthless agreement would be the agreement of countries that set up equal access to the South Pole. I guess this was entered into before anybody realized there might be some minerals under it. But if you can reach some kind of an agreement, of course, always you want to do so by rational discussion rather than force of arms. Just as, again, it's always analogous to two people. If we can work out an agreement between us that doesn't violate our rights, this is what we are bound by reason and by natural law to do, rather than take up force of arms with one another. But on the other hand, if I'm threatening your very life, then, and I take actions to take away your life, you have a right to defend it. This, too, is the case with respect to governments. There was a case, when was it? Just about 20 years ago, where Portugal was fishing within the territorial waters of Canada. Any of you remember that?
Spain or Spanish.
Was it Spain?
Spain.
Yeah. So of course then the question arose, can a foreign country come over and fish out your territorial waters? And I remember the closest it got to the act of war was, I think, the Canadian Coast Guard arrested one Spanish sea captain, and somehow it got settled. But these are the kinds of issues that arise. Some countries have a 200-mile territorial limit on their international limits on the ocean. Others, like the United States, for a long time only had a 3-mile limit. Some have a 12-mile limit. So obviously, you can get into problems, for example, up in the Arctic, where the Canadian territorial waters, according to Canadian law, extend so far that they overlap each other. And then the Americans, for example, want to go up through the middle of a channel, which according to their reading is in international waters. So you can see where you can have disagreements. And again, generally speaking, you're supposed to solve them peacefully. You're not supposed to go to war over them. Obviously, this doesn't always happen. Treaties, I guess I jumped the gun on that, but treaties are contracts. They are, if executed properly, they are just contracts that bind the parties in commutative justice, just as a just contract between you and me would bind us. See? And the treaty is binding under natural law because just as you and I have a right to enter into a contract under natural law, we are bound by that contract, so countries are bound by the contracts they enter into through treaties, which is why you have to be extremely careful before you sign a treaty. On the other hand, I do know that sometimes people withdraw from treaties. Countries withdraw from treaties. You can't withdraw from a contract, but countries sometimes will withdraw from a treaty. My reading indicates that treaties can be binding even if they are entered into under duress, as the result, for example, of defeat in a war. Of course, realize if you have a war, let's assume it's a just war. And one of the results of that just war may be a punitive imposition of a treaty that disadvantages the loser. And that can be just. I mean, the problem is we can always think of cases where it wasn't just, or where a treaty violates basic human rights. But you see, just as a commutative contract between you and me, if it violates one of our human rights, then it's not based on natural law, is it? Just like positive law, if it violates a natural human right, or violates natural law, is not binding, so too a treaty which violates natural law cannot be binding. So if you say, well, what about a treaty that allows the dominant country to come in and take half the citizens away and send them to Siberia or something? Well, that would violate natural law. Such a treaty would not be licit. But that doesn't mean that you can't get into treaties that would be binding. International goodwill. Just as we have an obligation to peace and friendship among ourselves, countries have an obligation to peace and friendship among themselves. Believe it or not, an obligation in charity. And countries ought to be charitable to one another. Well, at least they pretend to be when they meet diplomatically.
Is that along with an obligation of justice, or charity
If it-
supersedes justice?
I don't think charity can violate justice.
Not
Yeah.
violated, but where the emphasis is.
I think, realistically speaking, we start with justice.
Right.
Charity's nice if you can get beyond the justice. And of course, you do see this in humanitarian relief efforts. And, that's wonderful.
Mhm.
And frequently it goes from people to people, not from government to government. But that's something which we should realize as human beings, just as we have an obligation to help our fellow citizens, a moral obligation. If we are able to, we have a moral obligation to help those who are not our fellow citizens. It's the idea of the Good Samaritan. Again, this is highly complex, and you can always find examples that don't seem to fit right, and then you have to make sure that you're applying the principles, the basic principles, correctly, always understanding that natural law trumps anything that seems to violate it. You, for example, have an obligation of charity to nations that are in need, nation to nation. If one nation has abundance and another one is starving, there is a moral obligation, actually, on the part of the country with abundance to help the country that is starving. But not at risk to itself. I mean, you could well imagine, let's say you got a very large and powerful nation invading a small, weak nation, and a country that's more on the size of the small, weak nation is asking itself, should we intervene? And the small nation that's being picked on says, please help us. Well, the other small nation that's being asked to intervene would not be required to do so if it means that it's risking its own destruction, according to this principle. So you could do what you can do. What you cannot do, you cannot do. And this, of course, brings up a question of, since nations are equals and ought to be treated equally, there is a principle of non-intervention. We ought, a nation ought, not intervene in the affairs of another nation. But like any other principle, there are some limitations as to its application. For example, again, if one nation's attacking another, you have a right to intervene to defend the nation that's being attacked. And that's intervening in, country A attacks country B. To defend country B, you may have to go to war with country A. And that is licit because country A has violated natural law and you are engaged in self-defense or the defense of another through charity to help country B. It may be, another possibility of intervention is to assist a lawful government in putting down an unjust insurrection. You notice I have to qualify every term here, don't I? A lawful government assisting another lawful government to put down an unjust insurrection. Or to, perhaps to intervene in a country to end anarchy. Sometimes countries just totally break down. They absolutely are incapable of governing themselves, and the citizenry is just slaughtering itself. This is not unlike what you'd have to do if your next door neighbor, they all start killing each other. You have a right to try to stop them. But normally you don't have the right to interfere with what's going on in your next door neighbor's house, do you? So you see, you've always got to apply principles, and you know what you're applying, I suspect, in every case is double effect. You have a principle, it's laid down, it's a general principle that you don't interfere with another nation, just like you don't interfere with another family or don't interfere with another person. But in some cases, there is such a violation of natural law taking place that you act according to double effect to preserve the natural law with respect to this, and in the process, you permit the ignoring of the principle of non-intervention. So it is a very real and valid principle, but it's just analogous to like taking a drug. You don't take a drug that could harm you, do you? But yes, you do if the benefit outweighs the risk. So it's always analogous. You're always looking in ethics. Remember, you're looking at being. You're looking at the affirmation of being. You're looking at acting for the good, which is being, and tolerating the coincident evil that you don't will but permit. You can apply this at every level. To overturn a tyranny. There could be circumstances where some dictator is so tyrannically mistreating his people that it would be licit to rescue them from him. But again, of course, one has to be very careful because it gets so tempting to run around rescuing all your nearby countries, doesn't it? I say rescue with quotation marks. So those are some of the principles of international law which we need to lay down first before we look at the question of just war. Does anybody have any questions?
How do you define a war? Because now we can hear this word, like war for the fish, war for the forest, war in the Olympics. Two things.
The war on drugs?
War on drugs, yeah. So how do we define the war?
The war on ignorance?
The war, because now
Well,
there's aggression of one country to another, almost like this war, right?
I think you know it when you're in one.
No, but it's definition for the war to war. What it takes one or two, more than two countries.
The point is when people talk about something like the war on drugs or the war on saving the forests, it's not a real war. It's an analogous metaphorical use of the term.
Yes.
It's a pop slogan.
Yeah.
But this word is abuse.
Yeah, so we have to go back and look at what
Yeah.
it means.
What is
Yeah.
It's a technical term.
That's right. War.
The-
So how do you
There's a
define
victory
that?
involved. Usually implicit with the word war is,
You're,
The goal is a victory.
well, the war implies the use of force of arms to make the will of one nation imposed upon the will of another nation. Physical force. That's why I say you know it when you're in one.
we're talking about non-intervention, or a state has the right of its national sovereignty, right?
Right, right.
Okay, so now we have many Middle Eastern countries that the United States needs to reshape somehow, but they have national sovereignty. And if the governing system is not to the taste of the so-called democracy, the argument that, say, the U.S. or would make is that they're living in a tyrannical state.
Well, the first thing that you do with some country that's not doing what you want is you engage in diplomacy. You try to persuade them. You try to give them encouragement. You offer them trade agreements.
Yes, yes.
You try to be peaceful, in other words.
Yes, but, you know, that's what...
You try not to go to war. I mean, the real
Why-
problem is when you get into covert activities, right?
Yes, and also, I'm thinking of the monopolistic structure. I mean, the U.S. is really trying to form a monopoly in the Middle East, at least to my.
Let's put it very gently. It's a holocaust of the whole Arab culture and Arab religion and Arab nation. It's a holocaust. I mean, to say that, I mean, it's aggression, it's a terror. A world history has never witnessed anything so gruesome what the United States is performing in the whole world.
In the Middle East.
It's gruesome.
This is why, though, you've got to stick to the general principles rather than the immediacy of a political analysis of one context. The question is, how much can one country do to influence the behavior of another? You have a right to seek your common good, and they have a right to seek their common good. That's why I said, what is licit, if there seems to be some opposition between them, is diplomacy, to the extent that it is possible. You don't have the right to overturn them in some way or directly engage them with covert activity even, excepting if you are convinced and have sufficient reason to believe that your own national integrity is at issue. So when can you cross the line between just friendly diplomacy to engaging us in subverted acts of warfare? You know, I'm not going to try to settle every individual case because you see, you got two very clear different situations. One's where you're just like engaged in friendly diplomacy with the other nation. No problem with that. If they reject your diplomacy, that's their business. The other case is where you go to outright war with them. Well, if it's justified, that's not a problem either. The difficult case today is we see countries that interact with each other and they do it somewhere in between these two cases. And we begin to ask ourselves, well, what is licit? What is right? What can you do, especially when they're doing it to us, and are we doing it to them without declaring war? Bear in mind, you could always say, well, let's not have these little mini attacks on each other. We'll just go to outright war. Well, that's not necessarily a good thing. So it may be better to have limited covert activity than to absolutely declare war. And again, you know, I'm not trying to write history here. I'm not an expert on the history or the political affairs of all the countries involved. But these are the kind of principles that you have to bring to bear. And they all ultimately come down to respecting natural law, realizing that countries are like people, and they have rights like people. But again, you know, if your next door neighbor goes crazy and comes at you with a butcher knife, you have to deal with it.
Yeah, but
Or if he
That's not
has,
the case.
or if he has weapons of mass destruction.
Well, I'm trying not to get to We're going to get over to just war. I'm still trying to talk about international law. Wait till we get to the war. We can have a war over the war if you want, but not till we get to it. I'm still trying to deal with international law here. And I don't want to run too far afield before we get to it, but I guess if you have no questions about international law, we can declare war and proceed. And that is in the sense
Just
of
war.
just war.
But President, how one nation deals with a false accusation of another nation? Because we can go on and accuse, I can accuse you of being very unjust towards your children or wife and try to justify my interaction within your home. It's called propaganda, and it's as old as the world.
Well, don't confuse the accidents with the substance. There is something called truth. Natural law operates on truth. Many times what we call propaganda. Remember, the term propaganda originally came from the propaganda fidei, which was the idea of spreading the Catholic faith to the world, because it was the truth. That was what it was about. And of course, in World War II, we got a different idea of propaganda being spreading false lies, malicious rumors for purposes of gaining military conquest or dominating peoples. So we got a completely different meaning of the word. And sometimes, if, as they say, if you're going to use the word to mean that, you can have the word. I don't want it anymore. But I think that was in Alice in Wonderland. The point is, there is a truth. You accuse me of something, I accuse you of something. Well, look, there's a truth. And each one of us has an obligation to act in light of the truth. If you're lying to me and I know that you're lying to me, or I'm lying to you and you know I'm lying to you, it doesn't matter what we say. You know the truth and I know the truth, and that is what guides and makes licit or illicit our actions. And so it's hard, but you have to, when we're talking about natural law, we're talking about ethics, we're talking about what ought to be. So don't drag out examples of what people do that you think is wrong and they shouldn't be doing it, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what ought to be. And people have squabbled and fought and alleged and propagandized against each other for the whole history of mankind. That's not what ethics is about. Ethics is about trying to find the truth. Truth is being, the being is the good. And to follow it, as hard as it may be. I realize, look, it's like two political candidates going after each other. Where's the truth? How do you discern who to follow? How do you discern who should be supported and who shouldn't be? In many cases, you got to get through the fluff. You got to get through the propaganda. You got to get through the advertising and try to understand the principles that are being exercised and the likelihood of one candidate or another actually implementing those principles that are closest to, I would say, natural law. And so too with governments and countries. The same thing. You're not going to find any one government or country that is going to be lily pure. It just probably isn't going to happen. Just like you don't find people who are saints while they're still in this world. So sometimes you have to judge, who's basically doing what seems to be the right thing here in accordance with natural law, who is more clearly violating natural law. But even so, when you make that judgment, then you have to ask, well, what am I going to do about it? Because I have to act according to natural law in reference to the situation I'm looking at. And in a way, that's what one country does, looking at two other countries that are fighting. It asks itself, what is my obligation and right under natural law in reference to these two disputing parties? And who said that's easy? No, it's not going to be easy. You have emotion tied up in it. I mean, one group will say, 100 years ago, your people came in and raped all our women and killed all our children and took them off to Siberia or something, or Egypt, wherever it be. And therefore, I'll never forgive you. Well, this gets horribly complex, because 100 years ago, it wasn't you that did it, it was your great-great-great-grandparents that did it. It wasn't me that it was done to. See, you got to sort this stuff out, and don't get simply swept away by the emotion and the tapestry of the events as you've been raised to perceive them within your own society, within your own culture, and within your own news media, which may or may not be telling you the truth. That's why sometimes we don't know what the history of something is until 200 years later. This afternoon, I was just reading a reprise of what took place in World War I. You know, talk about looking at past history. And I'm sure it wasn't the way that the people at the time saw it. I mean, one of the things that people universally think is that in 1914, nobody saw that it would be a prolonged war. And apparently that wasn't the case. Military, the leaders on both sides knew it would be a horrible mess. But that didn't stop them. And you have things happen, I understand, for example, and not from what I was reading today, but when the Russians got into the war, what happened is they had a military plan to send all their troops forward, and they did. And then they realized they didn't have any means of telling them to stop and come back. So that's one way you get into a war. And then of course, there's also the rule that once the war started, you've got to live with what you're doing. And because now you're in it. It's like getting into a fight with somebody that you accidentally started, but now you're in the fight. Does that mean you're supposed to let them slit your throat? That's why it's so complicated. And that's why always when you're trying to approach something from the standpoint of ethics, you got to abstract from the emotions, the concrete circumstance, get the general principles first, and then see if you can apply them. And it takes a lot of self-control, mental self-control to do this sometimes. And that's why it's so rarely done. And in the complexities of the modern world, you know, I don't know whether all this can be applied in practice, but people have to live their lives. Leaders have to make decisions. We have to be careful not always to condemn them too easily, because if we were in their position, would we necessarily do any better? And do we really understand what they did and why they did it? I know we're very cynical and we often suspect the worst. And maybe we have good reason for doing so. And maybe all leaders are not to be trusted. But, you know, as Dr. Waters frequently said, you know, I'm in the world. I didn't make the world. I'm just in it. I got to live here. And that's what we have to do, but we have to try to apply those principles of ethics. And frankly, if nobody else is following them, that doesn't lessen my obligation to follow them. Each one of us is obliged to follow natural law. And that's what we're going to try to sort through just war theory. I'm not going to go too far into it tonight, but I do think it's kind of interesting. Nobody wants to have any influence in our secular society brought to bear by religious organizations or religion. And yet it's really funny, whenever you get to the idea of we're going to go to war, or should we go to war, all of the theorists come out and say, well, does this meet the criteria of a just war? And then you go back and they start explaining just war theory, and guess where it came from? Primarily, they'll go back to St. Augustine. So they wind up citing what is in fact a Catholic saint as the source for the justification of them going to war. And they won't accept religious influence on any other topic. But the problem is, everybody knows when you go to war, that's got tremendous moral weight falling upon those who make the decision to go to war, and you need to have a good explanation. And it just so happens the only one floating around is the just war theory, and it happens to have come originally from a religious source. So they're kind of stuck with it. So you see them back citing St. Augustine and some of those following him. So we will be, in the next class, if we don't get into a war between now and then, we'll be discussing just war. Almost you wonder if it isn't a contradiction in terms.
It is.
Well, I don't think so, for the same reason. It's not a contradiction in terms to defend yourself. And nations have a need and a right to defend themselves. The alternative is pacifism. And pacifism is wonderful. It works as long as you're living in a country that's strong enough to defend itself. I'll stop on that note.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.